So looking at the blood, we know that the cells in the body are serviced by two fluids, and that is interstitial fluid and blood. So if we look at this figure here to the right, we see the arterial becoming the capillary, then over to the left, coming back in at the venule end. So blood is contained in this system of vessels, and whenever fluids are forced out from the capillary beds, that fluid, which is kind of like a watered down form of blood plasma, it's like plasma minus the big plasma proteins that are confined to blood, are all in these little white spaces around the tissue cells, and it's called interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid in a large part gets reabsorbed here into the venule end of the capillary. If there is some left around these tissue cells, it enters into this green structure, and that is called a lymphatic capillary. So blood plasma is different than interstitial fluid in length and composition because it contains large plasma proteins confined to the bloodstream, but interstitial fluid and lymph are identical in composition. Interstitial fluid is just what we call it around the cells, and once it enters the lymphatic capillary, it is known as lymph. So we have blood for transportation of substances. Largely, we know oxygen and CO2. Also transports metabolic waste, heat, which is also a byproduct of ATP production. Also nutrients to our cells, as well as chemicals like hormones or drugs. It also will regulate many things, such as the pH of the blood. It has a very narrow range between 7.35 and 7.45. Anything outside of those values can lead to acidosis or alkalosis. They help regulate body temperature because water is a large part of plasma, and water has large coolant properties. You also have blood vessels close to the skin that dump out heat or can constrict and hold heat in. And then with dissolved ions and proteins in the plasma, it can help regulate the water content of cells by the water content in blood. Finally, because the blood system is a bit like a highway and it also houses many white blood cells, this is a big part of immunity, and it protects you from disease. Blood has a warm temperature as it transports heat of around 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. We said that the blood pH is between 7.35 and 7.45, a very narrow range. And on average, testosterone stimulates a bit more red blood cell production from red bone marrow. Males have about 5 to 6 liters of blood on average, whereas females have 4 to 5 liters on average. So these values are just averages. Hematocrit is the percentage of formed elements in blood, and 99% of those formed elements are red blood cells. So we could also look at hematocrit as our percentage of red blood cells. If you took a capillary tube, so a very small little tube of your own blood, and you put it in something called a microcentrifuge right now, what a centrifuge would do is spin things around until it separated the solid components out. So it would look like the picture you see over here to your left, and it would have a large clear area, a buffy coat, a small area separating the clear area from packed red areas. And if you measured that with a ruler, about 55% of that would be the clear area, which would represent blood plasma, and then the other 45 would be mostly red blood cells or formed elements. That buffy coat between the plasma and the red blood cells would be your white blood cells, which we'll see are in a much less percentage in blood than red blood cells. So you can see those packed blood cells at the bottom, and that would be a normal hematocrit, around 45%. Below that, someone is anemic. Above that, we'll see that someone may have something called polycythemia, or too high of hematocrit. So blood plasma is 90% water, which gives it some of that coolant property. Also, we'll look at how blood pressure is regulated that way. 9% are going to be plasma proteins, which we said makes plasma differ from interstitial fluid and lymph. Those plasma proteins are confined to blood and is very helpful in reabsorbing interstitial fluid back into the venule end of the capillary. The main one there is albumin, which maintains that osmotic pressure. Immune proteins, clotting proteins, transporting proteins are also found in blood. You have other things dissolved in blood, such as glucose, amino acids, ions, waste, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. Cirrhosis of the liver can actually cause lots of edema or swelling in the abdomen, and the reason for that is because it affects that blood osmotic pressure, or how fluids are reabsorbed into the venial end of the capillary. If your liver is not functioning correctly and you are not making those large plasma proteins, then you don't have the osmotic pressure to pull fluid back into that venial end of the capillary, which can lead to that edema. Another thing that someone with cirrhosis of the liver may end up having is clotting issues, because again, those clotting proteins are made in the liver. So same thing with other types of liver malfunction. Cirrhosis of the liver is common in the United States, is the 10th leading cause of death in men and 12th in women. So the formed elements in blood, we said the highest amount are going to be red blood cells, and those are known as erythrocytes. But we have around 1% or less white blood cells, and those are known as leukocytes. You've got two types of leukocytes. Neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils make up what we call granular leukocytes. And if you look at the images on the top of the screen, granulocytic leukocytes, or what we call granulocytes or granular leukocytes, look like they've been rolled in sand a little bit. And they have these little granules, cytoplasmic granules, that pick up stain. And that's what causes them to have those granules and be called granulocytes. Agranulocytes, agranular leukocytes, or agranulocytic white blood cells are the lymphocytes and monocytes. And if you look at those, they do not have those cytoplasmic granules, so they don't pick up the stain. Lymphocytes will be discussed a bit more in the lymphatic system. You've got three types: T cells, B cells, and natural killer cells. And we'll also look at monocytes. Finally, the last formed element is not actually a cell, but it is a cell fragment called a platelet or a thrombocyte. And they assist in the first part of hemostasis, or the blood clotting.